Laden, Alaki, okay, people who have used weapons of mass destruction. She is in exile in Cuba after escaping from prison, where she was accused of killing a police officer, and I've actually included a number of links because when this, I got sent this through social media, and so I kept the links and have basically talked about not only what you see on ABC News, but also what you see on things like Democracy Now!, the Huffington Post, a website called The Root, which is basically a black kind of social media website talking about Assata Shakur. She's an era from the Black Panther, Black Liberation Army. So it should be noted, Black Liberation Army, which I may or may not have mentioned in the what I referred to as the blacklist last week. Just like the African National Congress had a political wing and a military wing. So political wing for working within the system that was usually arrayed against it, and then a military wing, because working within the system usually got you put in prison or killed. And so, all right, military force. So in the same sense, the ANC, the Black Panther Party, not only had groups like secret cells like Crips, but it also had the Black Liberation Army, which was explicitly about having an armed revolution against the forces of the United States. So Assata was basically, she had escaped in the 70s and went to exile and received political exile in Cuba and has been there to this day. She's 64 years old. In case you were wondering about the similarity of name, a number of black people took on African names. Afeni Shakur is actually Tupac's mother. Assata is like an aunt, just like Matula Shakur is an uncle. So she's one of Tupac's step-aunts. The reward was doubled to $2 million dead or alive. And one of the things that she had talked about, you know, the question that I had asked is, why now? Like, she's been in Cuba since the 70s. She's old. And you have, you know, they used actually a black FBI agent to say, oh, this is a criminal and she should be brought to justice and she killed a cop, and, well, actually she's been acquitted of all the things that you charged her with that put her in prison. Like the claim that she killed a cop. Well, there was a traffic stop in New Jersey. She was asked to get out of the car with her hands up. She did so. She was shot in the back twice. One of the bullets broke the clavicle on the supposed gun arm. So trooper ended up dead, but she wasn't capable of doing it. There was no gunshot residue. There was no fingerprint. Her fingerprints went on the gun. No evidence. No evidence pointed to the things that she said was alleged to have done. The police themselves actually said they lied under oath. Boom. She got into prison anyway.
Political.
Yeah, so like a political prisoner. So.
Yeah, well, it's political. The reason they're going after her now.
Probably.
Because the Castros are going to be out of power, and they're going to use that as a negotiating point.
That seems to be the most likely explanation, but of course the government isn't admitting that. So basically, to put that in context, the Castros who have been in power, who have harbored her, may be going out of power in the foreseeable future, so they might extradite her. But by posting $2 million dead or alive, somebody could go to Cuba and kill her and claim the reward. Because she said, and the reason she's gotten political asylum before is basically because it was proven, you know, that she that any police officer could also shoot her dead and alive, and again, not having been acquitted of whatever she'd been accused of, you know, she's basically staying in Cuba. So I place the onus on Obama because evidence shows as if she's innocent of her charges, but convicted because of her political views. And is this person, you could ask the question, responsible for actual deaths, like Al-Qaeda, or is it her ideas and example that are dangerous, which is one of the things we'll be looking at in terms of the whole Black Power movement, both not only here in the United States, but internationally, and its implications for what's going on with us today. So, sidebar conversation. For example, there is a movie coming out, or is already made and is actually showing in places with more black people than Oregon. Free Angela Davis and All Political Prisoners is kind of an autobiography of Angela. And on NPR, I heard on Michelle Martin's Tell Me More program, a black police officer is protesting the Angela Davis movie, claiming that the Black Panther Party killed 17 police officers. Now, any death diminishes me, I will say that. But 17 to the Black Panther Party? Okay. I'll concede the point without contesting the accuracy, because just like Huey Newton was accused of killing a police officer, did he do it? He got convicted, but then he got released. So, is it those convictions the same? But I'll concede the point. Let's say that the Black Panthers actually did kill 17 cops. How many cops have killed black people justifiable homicide? More than 17. How many police officers have white supremacists and militias killed? And how come they're not being on the terrorist want list? The white supremacists. Emerge magazine published an article noting 100 plus black police officers have been killed on duty by white police officers, often from the same precinct, who mistook them for criminals. Now that was in the period between 1990 and 2000, when the magazine was at its heyday. It doesn't exist anymore. But in the previous decade, basically tracked by an organization of black police professionals, 100 black police officers have been killed by white officers in that time. Often by some people in the same precinct. Often while essentially doing their job and being mistaken for criminals. Certainly more than 17 police officers, but nothing being said about that. I actually Googled, that, and that's still continuing to this day. Right? So, as a sidebar conversation. So, a shot of Shakur in her own words, and I've gotten links from Democracy Now! That you can follow. I have advocated, and I still advocate, revolutionary changes in the structure and the principles that govern the United States. I advocate self-determination for my people and for all oppressed people inside the United States. I advocate an end to capitalist exploitation, the abolition of racist policies, the eradication of sexism, and the elimination of political repression. If that is a crime, then I am totally guilty. So notice in her statement, she does not advocate the violent overthrow of the United States government. Revolutionary changes in the structure and the principles that govern the United States is different than targeting buildings and personnel of the United States government.
It says in the Constitution you can revolt.
It does say that in the Constitution. So I've included links, 3 views that are thumbs up. From The Root, for example, the FBI list reflects the very logic of terrorism. why go after Assad now? Basically talks about the same thesis, essentially that, you know, the Cubans are going to be out of power, we're going to be able to get her now. But yeah, why now, really? Sending a message to other people. And this is a longer interview with Angela Davis and Assata Shakur's lawyer, who also represented Nelson Mandela, because, oh, by the way, while he was president, Nelson Mandela was on the terrorist watch list of the United States. So, Mandela's on the terrorist watch list, Assata's on the terrorist watch list.
MLK.
Martin Luther King would have been on the terrorist watch list. Yeah. And this is the FBI. So, talking about Black Power movements, plural, because we usually think in an American context, and I want you to move beyond that. African liberation movements and nonviolent advocates for social change from colonialism after World War II. So that's what I mean by Black Power movements. Many of those were courted by the U.S. Many African nations, remember, because after World War II, the good thing about Hitler is that basically he weakened Europe enough so that they began to lose their colonies, and their colonies began to advocate for independence and local sovereignty, etc. Many of those African nations were courted by the U.S. and the USSR not to help their cause for freedom, but because they had strategic resources.
It split up Africa after Potsdam.
Yeah. So strategic resources basically are things that you can use for your military, or what was referred to by President Eisenhower as the military-industrial complex. Okay, because it's not just weapons of war, it's also, you know, consumer goods that support, that are often made by people who make weapons of war, too. Right? So, they go after, so one of the things that happens with African liberation movements is you have democratically elected leaders who, in reacting to the racism in the United States, question some of its policies, particularly during, you know, the 50s and 60s when they were being courted by both the United States and the old Soviet Union. So 2 years after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, in 1961, the United States, Belgium, and Britain supported the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first legally elected Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, part of this, now this is from The Guardian, which is a British newspaper.
Belgium, they apologized for killing Patrice Lumumba in 2002. Because, I mean, the way they lynched him.
Yeah.
It was like, Congo, and they didn't want, like, to really go, so they started pushing until they got their apology from the Belgian government.
They got an apology?
Yeah.
An actual apology?
Yeah.
Wow.
2002.
Oh, well, that's right. It's not Americans. Americans hate apologizing.
Right.
The Belgians apologize.
Well, they pushed them to do that because, like, apparently France, from one visit from a French president to Algeria, he didn't want to apologize.
Yeah.
Yeah, but apparently the Congo, they went through a long process so they can put them, like, to apologize. They pushed them to apologize for that.
So it wasn't a willing, heartfelt apology.
Yeah, well, the way they killed Patrice Lumumba, no one was going to apologize for that unless you push it to apology.
Yeah.
Wasn't the person, was this around the time that, man, I'm forgetting the name, but I think it was like King something, he had like some kind of title that was in the Congo?
King Leopold.
Yeah.
Of Belgium. King Leopold II of Belgium.
And then his crony or whatever, his, right-hand man or whatever in the Congo. I forgot his name. But was Lumumba the one that overthrew?
No, Lumumba was democratically elected.
Well,
So-
okay, yeah, right.
So here's the context. So why kill a democratically elected leader? Well, consider this in context. What happened in Iran in 54, or actually 53?
Yes.
Democratically elected leader,
Sure.
Mossadegh, okay, decided he was going to nationalize the oil that had been, I think I talked about this before, but basically it was an 80-20 split between British Petroleum and the Iranian government. And so Mossadegh and basically the oil workers, the Iranian oil workers were basically living in large tents while the British oil workers were living in air-conditioned luxury. And the democratically elected leader of Iran basically proposed a 60-40 split, that is, with 60% going to Iran and 40% going to British Petroleum, because after all, it is our oil. Thank you for giving us the technology to get it out of the ground, but it is our oil. 80% shouldn't go to you, and 20% go to us. Maybe 60 should go to us, and 40% go to you after you've recouped your investment. Well, that, didn't sit well with British Petroleum, who called for the U.S. to say, oh, this communist, and they overthrew the democratically elected leader and put in the Shah of Iran. Trained a secret police force, etc. So, democratically elected leaders who are indigenous people of color who naturally act in the interest of their people and not necessarily act in the interest of foreign corporations are a problem. So this is from The Guardian. For 126 years, the US and Belgium played key roles in shaping Congo's destiny. In April 1884, 7 months before the Berlin Congress, the US became the first country in the world to recognize the claim of Leopold II of the Belgians to the territories of the Congo Basin. When the atrocities related to brutal economic exploitation in Leopold's Congo Free State resulted in millions with an M of fatalities, the U.S. joined other world powers to force Belgium to take over the country as a regular colony, because a free state is even worse than a colony. And it was during the colonial period that the U.S. acquired a strategic stake in the enormous natural wealth of the Congo, following its use of the uranium from Congolese mines to manufacture the first atomic weapons, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. So, in case you were wondering why we were interested in Congo, boom, there it is. So when we talk about strategic resources, it's basically about war making and or money making. The outbreak of the Cold War is inevitable that the U.S. and its Western allies would not be prepared to let Africans have effective control over strategic raw materials, lest they fall into the hands of their enemies in the Soviet camp. Not that that was necessarily likely, but it is in this regard that Patrice Lumumba's determination to achieve genuine independence and to have full control over Congo's resources in order to utilize them to improve the living conditions of our people was perceived as a threat to Western interests. To fight him, the U.S. and Belgium used all the tools and resources at their disposal, including the United Nations Secretariat under Dag Hammarskjöld and Ralph Bunche, to buy the support of Lumumba's Congolese rivals and hired killers. In Congo, Lumumba's assassination is rightly viewed as the country's original sin, coming less than 7 months after independence. So imagine the United States gets together to kill your democratically elected leader 7 months after independence.
Is that the airplane that got shot down?
No, he was killed on the ground.
Oh, okay, because there's another incident.
They're supposed
Yeah.
to protect him. So
So, it was a stumbling block to the ideals of national unity, economic independence, and pan-African solidarity that Lumumba had championed, as well as a shattering blow to the hopes of millions of Congolese for freedom and material prosperity, which could then give you a clue for the pattern that would happen in other places that were in similar circumstances in Africa, and what makes certain folks dangerous. So, as Kennedy once said, when you make peaceful revolution impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable. So this is why there are revolutionary movements in Africa, in places like Congo, the former Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, South Africa, Algeria, wherever, okay? There was a white minority controlling by military force a black majority in order to exploit labor under, I'm just not sugarcoating it, this is slavery. The only reason it's neo-slavery is they're getting paid, kind of.
What's neo?
New.
No.
Oh.
Old slavery is you don't get no money. Neo-slavery, just like in Hawaii, where you're working in the sugar cane, you might be getting paid, but they're whipping you to produce labor.
And your money would be gone before they even actually get it because, you have to buy
Right.
supplies.
50
blah,
cents
blah,
a day.
blah.
50 cents a day, yeah. So in order to exploit labor under neo-slavery conditions and mineral wealth at a profit. Okay, so these movements were also making connections to black Americans and the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. And you know what happens when you do that? That had to be stopped from the point of view of the US government. Hence, Cold War anti-communism, because one of the things why we were overtly against communists, besides the economic competition, is communists were also pro-equality, pro-racial equality, pro-gender equality, etc.
And Marxists preach revolution.
And Marxists did preach revolution, yes, but, right? So, focus on civil rights leaders who talked about racial equality and blacklisting, not the sense that I was talking about where it's positive, but basically putting people on a list and saying that they're undesirable, denying them work. One of the movies that's on the list in the syllabus is Scandalize My Name, which is basically a list of black actors who are also activists, many of whom you have never heard of because of that blacklisting. People like Canada Lee and Paul Robeson and other actors like that. True compassion, Martin once said, is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. So what he's talking about edifices, he's talking about systems and institutions of the United States. So the idea is that, slight tangent. I had a discussion with one of my work studies who used this term criminogenic. That means it generates crime. Now, in her training, reflecting her training, the view of that training presupposes that the fault of criminogenic behavior is in the criminal, not in the systems that create criminals or the need to commit crime. So, for example, if somebody's driven into addiction and drugs are really expensive, how do they pay for their habit? The only way they can pay for the habit is, boom, crime. So, criminogenic behavior generates crime. So my point was, systems generate criminals. Just like Martin's point is, poverty is not an accident. It's created. That's what he's saying. An edifice is not just a building. If you study your dictionary, edifice is not a building, it's an institution. Back to slide, thanks. Okay, so radical restructuring. Calling for restructuring society while producing real-world solutions to structural inequities. Basically, this part of the Black Power movement is talking about, okay, we need to restructure society. And it's not just the Black Power movement. Martin Luther King is considered part of the civil rights movement, but it should be seen as two different wings of the same thing. Right? So if he's talking about an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. We wouldn't call them beggars. Let's say they're homeless people today. Homeless people are not necessarily there by their choice. They are produced by society.
Seems broad.
Interview them. I have. None of us is farther away than 3 paychecks from being homeless.
Right.
Definitely not. So, what happens if your job is sent to Indonesia? Whose decision was that? Not necessarily yours.
We don't have social economy problem.
Yeah.
It's not sure.
So, part of the Black Power movement is calling for radical, what I mean radical, equitable. Radical restructuring while producing real-world solutions to structural inequities. The idea is that poverty is neither an accident nor a matter of individual laziness. Poverty is an act of systemic violence against particular groups of people to maintain control for the benefit of a few. It's not a matter of how hard you work. So it might be. Probably not, though. And that's when they talk about, restructure. That's what Martin was talking about in terms of the edifices that produce beggars. Right? So, for example, a great deal of the world lives on $1.25 a day or less. Like most of the world outside of the United States and the so-called first world. How much does it cost you for you to live for a day?
About 20.
Okay. If you're homeless and a student, because we do at in-service, this was discussed actually, that there are homeless. I've been here for 21 years, and there have been homeless students all my time here. So it wasn't exactly news to hear that. There are homeless students living like in the fields all around LCC. Wow. Okay. So, right. How do you manage that? And they talked about some of their experience and what we could do systemically to deal with that at Lane. Right?
Have you known them to come up out of that
Yeah.
homeless situation?
Yes.
After school?
It is difficult, but then again, part of a civil rights movement is not just to have them organize in a homeless students club, right? Not simply to have us have a food bank, because we already have a free drug counselor. We already have a free health clinic, the only one of the community colleges in the state to have a free health clinic. Right? So we have the no cash clothing stash, but we don't have a food bank, because that's an issue. Eating. right? How much of your monthly budget goes to paying for housing, and how much you have left over if you do food stamps. Oh, by the way, if you're going to get food stamps, this is a revelation, I didn't know this particular detail. If you are a full-time student, in order to get food stamps, you're also required to work 20 hours a week. Like, right, and study and take care of kids, right. Whose idea is that? I mean, that's like welfare reform requiring a single mom to work 5 minimum wage jobs part-time to receive benefits, including food stamps. Who's raising the kid? Oh, we don't care about that, right? That is a structural inequity while paying billions, with a B, of dollars to farmers to not grow food. So, and guess which is more? Corporate welfare, big agribusiness, or aid going to families? Temporary assistance to needy families. Right. So when we're talking about structural inequities,
Most of that money goes to corn products that make fructose. Most of that money.
what they're talking about in the civil rights movement back then was stuff like this. When it was more glaring, wasn't any social media. You just had newspapers and the radio and some television, right, to talk about this kind of stuff. So, the conditions that create homelessness are systemic and part of an unequal system. So, peaceful restructuring or violent revolution. So, Martin practiced Satyagraha. I mentioned that word before you? Okay. In this class, right?
No.
Satyagraha. So, Sat means truth. Satyagraha in Sanskrit means holding on to truth. So it means several things. And it basically was articulated by Gandhi. So it's not just nonviolence, it's also telling the truth and truth-telling, and also civil disobedience. Rather than being violent, you instruct your opponent by your nonviolent actions, and you tell the truth about your experience. So he's basically talking about, there's an edifice. There are structures in society that produce inequity. That's just a simple fact, but it's controversial, not because it's not true, but because he revealed a truth that's dangerous. Because then what's the solution? Malcolm X, I've actually run into people in Eugene when I say the singular Malcolm, they go Malcolm who? And I've used Malcolm and Martin who? Malcolm who? We must be in Eugene. It's like, Denzel. Which Denzel? Jay-Z. Which? I'll stop. So, Malcolm preached self-determination and self-defense. Self-defense, as he said, is not violence, it's common sense. Satyagraha actually requires you not even to defend yourself when you're attacked, which, as a martial artist, I'm not really down with that myself, but I can see it as a superior spiritual path if you're not afraid of dying.
Right.
It requires being not afraid of dying.
Injured really bad.
Right. Anyway, Malcolm preached self-determination, self-defense, self-reliance, and making cross-cultural alliances within the United States and with Africa and the so-called third world. And that's what makes him dangerous. Because basically he talked about making those alliances, just like I was talking about with that blacklist. The Organization of African Unity was basically looking at creating a United States of Africa, right? The Organization of African American Unity, created by Malcolm X, was not only uniting across racial and other lines in the United States, but also connecting black people with liberation movements in Africa, making them feel proud of being African, shifting from that whole Negro thing. This picture is actually the only time they ever met, which is basically testifying in Congress for the Civil Rights Bill. And anti-war Martin and OAAU Malcolm. The Organization of African Unity was actually up and running by the time this picture was taken. So my thing is not that Martin and Malcolm were killed. It's when they were killed and why they were killed you need to pay attention to. So let's take Martin as an example. Okay, they're not enemies. But they had the same goals, they had different tactics. Even though Malcolm did criticize Martin, basically on tactics. What's effective? He's saying, look, racists can't be reformed. Now, his error, and basically his error was sort of corrected by taking the Hajj when he met non-racist white Muslims. Changed his entire life. Because, Elijah Muhammad taught that white people were devils, and created a whole universe that presupposed that. So Malcolm actually going to Mecca and meeting Muslims that were not only non-racist, but of European origin. Wow, okay. How do I deal with that? So I need to expand my vision. So they had different tactics. They were closer than many people thought or were allowed to think. I have several sources for this, but if you wanted a really great interview, the Iconoclasts, which is a Sundance Channel series where celebrities interview each other. Season 2, episode 6, Dave Chappelle and Maya Angelou. And so Dave is basically talking with Maya Angelou, and he's saying, wow, when you're talking about Martin and Malcolm, you're talking about them like they're your friends. And she says, yeah, well, they were my friends. They were personal friends. They were friends with each other. Which surprised him because, again, if you believe in contemporary history, they must have been fighting. Well, no, they just had different tactics. Okay, both being on the COINTELPRO hit list. Okay, which is the FBI and intelligence community basically trying to prevent the rise of a black messiah or a person that could unite black America. Right? Their enemies are in the background, though they are in Congress for that 64 Civil Rights Bill hearing. So just like, for example, with Assad Shakur, who is it, actually looking at other people who are on the terrorist watch list, and when Mandela was on the terrorist watch list, and Condoleezza Rice said, yeah, it's kind of embarrassing. I don't know who decided to do this, but it's embarrassing. Because, wait, these people are allies now, even though we supported apartheid back then for strategic minerals. Hendrix, as I told you earlier in the class, was actually murdered. He didn't die of a drug overdose. He's actually murdered by waterboarding with wine a week before his contract expired. He was planning to leave his manager because his manager was stealing money. His manager was part of British intelligence. Desired to take his music in black directions with gospel and jazz, working with Miles Davis, among others. And COINTELPRO was interested in Hendrix because of his association with the Black Panthers and the anti-war movement. Now, it's not likely that Jimmy would have been a black messiah to unite America, a black American, because yeah.
Why would British intelligence be scoping him out?
They worked together, but basically his manager was probably more interested. I mean, he was making millions of dollars off of Jimmy, and skimming profits from record sales and concert sales and so. I mean, Jimmy was living a lavish, lifestyle. So, not necessarily, the brother that wrote the book Jimi Hendrix, Voodoo Child, is a black musician, basically talking about, look, it's not so much that British intelligence was interested in him per se, it's just the connections of the manager to underworld figures. Like, how do you arrange somebody to be killed without it being tied to you, right? So all we know is, basically, what I was saying, his thesis was, look, this is from the medical report. There's wine in his lungs, but not in his stomach. Right? So the drugs that he'd taken, the Vesperus, the sleeping pill, barely had time to get into his system. He died of drowning. His hair was soaked in wine. His clothes were soaked in wine. The bedclothes were soaked in wine. Right? And he's not a wine drinker. Okay? He drank Jack Daniels, hard liquor, whiskey, bourbon. Not a wine drinker. So, boom, there it is. How do you get your hair, your clothes? No, somebody's holding you down, which is not going to leave marks, holding you down and essentially drowning you with wine. And time of death was also interesting too.
Either.
So time of death, when somebody finally called the police and the ambulance arrives at 11:30 in the morning, they establish the time of death as 3 in the morning.
He was also anti-war and anti-colonialism, and there's some colonies that got the independence in the 90s, so that it was like an influence for those people.
Yeah. So the interesting code of COINTELPRO in him is legitimate. I mean, they did have some connections with Panthers and the anti-war movement, definitely. But whether that warrants, and him getting murdered essentially separately from that, it's basically the connection I said with, his manager being part of British intelligence or a stringer for British intelligence or whatever. That just means you can get people to kill other people and cover your tracks. Because knowing that this was in the report, the medical report, you start a murder investigation because clearly he didn't kill himself, which means murder investigation, which means then you start looking for people with motive. Who has a motive except the manager? And who can then get that kind of investigation squelched? The manager himself died under mysterious circumstances when a plane that he was on, a passenger jet he was on, blew up, killing all people on board. So, how does that happen without it being, labeled a terrorist attack? Killing hundreds of dozens of civilians to get one person? Who does that kind of thing? Not the mafia. So, in '67, the whitewash that I was referring to, King had become the country's most prominent opponent of the Vietnam War. staunch critic of overall U.S. foreign policy, which he deemed militaristic. In his Beyond Vietnam speech delivered at New York's Riverside Church a year to the day before he was killed, King called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. From Vietnam to South Africa to Latin America, King said the U.S. was on the wrong side of a world revolution. King questioned our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and asked why the U.S. was suppressing revolutions of the shirtless and barefoot people in the third world instead of supporting them. In terms of democracy. Great question. Why? Money. In foreign policy, King offered an economic critique complaining about capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries. That is, you're pouring all this money into the country, making money off of them, but the people's lives aren't improved thereby. His Beyond Vietnam speech was denounced by the mainstream press. Time magazine called it demagogic slander that sounded like a script for Radio Hanoi, because we're in the middle of Vietnam War. The Washington Post patronized that King has diminished his usefulness to his cause, his country, his people. But he's correct. King in his last months was organizing his most militant project, that's militant for nonviolent social change activists, the Poor People's Campaign. He crisscrossed the country to assemble a multiracial army of the poor that would descend on Washington, engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience at the Capitol until Congress enacted a Poor People's Bill of Rights. All right, so nobody's saying this. This is what makes him dangerous. All right? The March on Washington in '63 is basically trying to have equal rights for black people because of racial discrimination. But now, 4 years later, you're coming back with a Poor People's Bill of Rights, and you're going to have a multiracial army of the poor descend on Washington. That's even more dangerous, because you're making alliances across the differences that people are artificially created to hate each other across. Reader's Digest, a right-wing magazine, even that purports to be, it still exists, right?
Yeah.
Reader's Digest, warned of an insurrection. King's Economic Bill of Rights called for programs to rebuild America's cities. He saw a crying need to confront a Congress that had demonstrated its hostility to the poor, appropriating military funds with alacrity and generosity, but providing poverty funds with miserliness. On the evening of April 4th, '68, Martin Luther King was in Memphis supporting a workers' strike. By the end of the day, top-level Army snipers were in position to knock him out if ordered. 2 military officers were in place on the roof of a fire station near the Lorraine Motel to photograph the events. 2 black firemen had been ordered not to report to duty that day, and a black Memphis police detective on surveillance duty in the fire station was physically removed from his post and taken home, as well as other black officers reassigned away from the Lorraine Motel that day. Dr. King's room in the motel was changed from a secluded ground floor to number 306 on the balcony. The ground floor room was not visible from where the sniper was, the balcony was. Lloyd Jowers, owner of Jim's Grill, which backed onto the motel from the other side of the street, had already received $100,000 in cash for his agreement to participate in the assassination. He was to go out into the brush area behind the grill with the shooter and take possession of the gun immediately after the fatal shot was fired. When the dust settled, King had been hit, and a cleanup procedure was immediately set in motion. James Earl Way was effectively framed, the snipers dispersed, any witnesses who could not be controlled were killed, and the crime scene was destroyed. So, what I just said, basically this is actually taken from a book called An Active State, written by, I think his name was Pepper. He's a King family attorney, filed a federal lawsuit in which the King family called 77 witnesses. It went before a grand jury, and basically the only damages that the King family was asking was $100 for the burial. Now, bear in mind, when this lawsuit happened, it's the late 90s, all right? So he's already buried. Asking $100 in damages is basically just a token amount because you have to ask something, right? The grand jury basically reached the conclusion and the verdict that the United States government, Memphis Police Department, the FBI, and the governor's office basically colluded to assassinate Martin Luther King. He was shot by Army snipers. The author actually actually visited one of the snipers. Jowers admitted to setting all this stuff up. He also was defending James Earl Ray in a retrial. James Earl Ray said, look, I didn't shoot him. Look, there are lots of people who wanted to kill King. Lots of people would step forward to do it. Okay? The fact that you have Army snipers doing it means that this is also happening with the full knowledge of the White House.
If you trace James L. Ray's movements for that assassination, it's obvious that he's being manipulated and, controlled by somebody.
Sure. I mean, how do you get out of the country without a passport? Anyway, the idea is, yes, he was assassinated. A lot of us felt, before this trial that the government had a hand in Dr. King's death. It was proven in a court of law. You have never heard that. It was not a news item in 1999, was it? Okay, but there is a book, and basically there are trial transcripts, etc., etc.
Yeah, there the book.
An Active State, the assassination of Martin Luther King by his lawyer.
His relationship with J. Edgar Hoover is very suspect.
Sure, well, yeah. That Hoover